When we created the Hello iOS app, we saw how simply selecting an appropriate project template automatically created all of the required iOS infrastructure for us. This allows us to very quickly stand up a basic shell application without needing to concern ourselves with the general setup. In this lesson, we'll take a look at exactly what was created by this project template and talk more generally about the basic startup sequence that all iOS apps go through. Let's begin by looking at an illustration of this startup process. When a user taps an app icon on the iOS springboard, the operating system then immediately invokes the application's main function. So this is the starting point for all iOS apps. The main function on its own doesn't do a whole lot. Instead, it immediately delegates off to this function called UI application main. And UI application main is the main bootstrapping function that all iOS apps have. One of the first things this function does is it reads this configuration file called info.plist. This contains general configuration for our application, things such as the product name, the bundle identifier, which device types it supports. Once it's read this file, it then goes and creates an instance of this class called UI application. Every iOS application will have one instance of UI application running at all times, and this is responsible for managing the general lifecycle of the application. Additionally, it's responsible for creating and managing the application's event loop. So as new touch events or keyword events come in, they get added to the event loop. The UI application can pick those off and then delegate those appropriately throughout the app as needed. Now, as UI application is a very generic general object that needs to work equally well in all applications, it works in tandem with what's considered its application delegate. UI application main is also responsible for creating an instance of a class adopting this protocol called UI application delegate. As interesting lifecycle events happen on UI application, it will turn around and ask its delegate if it would like to customize that behavior at that particular point in time. The UI application delegate represents the main point of entry for our custom application code. One of the key responsibilities that the UI application delegate has is it's responsible for building up the user interface. So the first thing it will typically do is create an instance of UI window. The UI window really doesn't do a whole lot on its own. It really just acts as a holding place for other user interface elements. The UI application delegate will also create an instance of what's considered the root view controller. This is the main controller component that's responsible for managing the main user interface of your application. Let's switch back to our project and see how the files on the file system relate to the elements we see in this illustration. If we highlight the root of this project, we'll be presented with this general summary screen. And from here we can see some general project configuration that we specified when we created the project. For instance, we have the company identifier and the product name specified under this bundle identifier. Likewise, we specified that this application is available to run on iPhones. You see that represented here. And there are a number of other configuration options we can change here as well. But let's look at the files under the supporting files group, and specifically we'll start by looking at this main.m. So this is the main function that gets invoked when your application first starts up. And as you can see, this isn't doing a whole lot on its own. It creates an instance of this thing called auto-release pool. When we talk about Objective-C and some memory management topics, we'll talk more about what that is, but you can safely ignore it for now. You can see primarily what it's doing is it delegates off to this UI application main function. So the main function is responsible for bootstrapping the application, reading in our configuration file, creating an instance of UI application, and it's also responsible for creating this class called appDelegate. So let's take a look at the appDelegate. We'll look at appdelegate.m. In this method called application did finish launching with options, this represents what happens when the application first starts up. So in here we create a new instance of a UI window, so this main container component that fills the screen and provides us a holding spot where we can attach additional user interface elements. It creates an instance of our view controller, and this will be responsible for managing the main user interface of our application. It sets the view controller as the root view controller. Let's take a look at the view controller. We've actually seen this already. This is where we wrote our custom say hello method. And we'll talk in great detail about what view controllers are, what their responsibilities are. But suffice it to say, for right now, its main responsibility is to load the user interface that we defined within our viewcontroller.xib file, and then presenting that on screen. I'd recommend experimenting with the other project templates to see how the output of each one differs. It can be useful to get a good understanding of the way these project templates work, so you'll always know how and where to customize their output. I hope you've now got a clearer understanding of the iOS startup process, and I'll see you in the next lesson.